As I was coming on to my 18th birthday, my mom took me aside and said, "You're going to be a man soon. You got to learn to drink and smoke." So I wanted to be a man, and I put myself to work learning to drink and smoke. After almost 20 years of that, I finally got free of the nicotine part, thanks to the help of the American Lung Association here in Oakland. But I kept on drinking, and by the time I entered my 50s, I was drinking to the point of passing out almost every night. Here's how I got my wake-up call. One Saturday afternoon, my son, who was then 10 and in middle school, came to me with the air of a boy wanting help with his homework. He'd been reading a book in middle school called The Great Horn Spoon, about the California Gold Rush days, and there's a chapter in it that has a barroom brawl. And holding the book open and pointing to a word, he says, "Dad, you're a drunkard, aren't you?" That word cut right to my heart. I had no shield for it. I realized that I was blowing the dad act. I grew up without a dad. Lots of good people have grown up without dads. There's nothing wrong with it. But I wanted my kids to have a dad. And when that was said to me by him, I pondered whether maybe a kid who has a drunkard for a dad might be worse off than a kid who has no dad at all. And that one word, one child intervention tipped a balance inside of me. The balance between the part of me that wanted to drink and use and didn't care whether I died drinking and using, was in fact pretty sure that I would, and the other part of me that was sick and tired of drinking and using and wanted to get free of that ball and chain that I was dragging around with me every day and wanted to have a life but didn't have the resolve to do it. So under the impact of that one word coming from my child, I picked up the phone and called the drug and alcohol abuse program, it was then called, of Kaiser Permanente here in Oakland, and made an appointment. Dr. Breyer, who was then the medical director of the Kaiser program, did the intake interview and asked me the usual series of 100 questions, what did you use, and so forth and so on. And then he told me that as part of the program, I would have to attend support groups. And he held up two schedules. One was a little booklet with the AA meetings, and the other part was a crumpled sheet of paper with the alternative meetings. I asked a few questions, and I found out that the AA meetings were based on the concept of a higher power, or God as you understood him, and that the alternative meetings were secular. Dr. Breyer said, "We don't care which ones you go to, mix and match or whatever, but go to 2 a week." Now, I was raised religious. My mom and dad both studied for the ministry. I was an altar boy in an Episcopalian church in Kansas City. I probably still could do the thing with the cruets and the wafers today. I did it so many times. But I saw the church from the inside and behind the scenes. And that's not a good place to be if you want to keep your religious faith. So when Dr. Breyer gave me the choice of support groups, I chose the secular one. And I've kept going. I never did go to an AA or 12-step meeting. I've never done a step, never had a sponsor. And as I stand here today, I am 16 years, 7 months, and 7 days clean and sober. Thank you. I want to start by giving you a thumbnail sketch of the Life Ring approach. First the philosophy, then the meeting format. Many of you already know this, but there are a number of people here who probably don't, so I will. Our basic philosophy is summarized as the 3 S, letter S. Sobriety, secularity, and self-help. By sobriety, we mean abstinence. We are an abstinence-based organization, always have been, always will be. When people wander into our rooms, as they do very occasionally, and say that my goal is just to cut down or drink less, We say very politely to them, we wish you the very best of luck, but you're in the wrong room. You need to find another organization. What we support here is abstinence. And if that's your objective, then you're welcome to belong. The second S is secularity. Secularity means that we take responsibility for our own recovery. Your belief or your disbelief in a God or other higher power is your private business in LifeRing. We did a membership survey in 2005 and found that approximately 40% of our people attending meetings went to church or synagogue or temple or whatever during the past year, and that's about the national average. So we are not primarily an atheist or agnostic group. But inside of our meetings, we don't do either religion or anti-religion. We don't do theology in general, just like we don't do politics in our meetings. Your opinions on those issues are your private business, and we would, if that's violated, the meeting facilitator will ask you to continue to keep it your private business, please. In that respect, we're much like meetings of Weight Watchers or Curves or any number of other programs where your basic issue is your lifestyle, it's your diet, it's your exercise habits, it's your skills and attitudes that help to keep you healthy. And similarly in LifeRing, it's the practical issues, the attitudes that keep you sober that we discuss, and your religious beliefs just don't come into it. Our third S, self-help, means, among other things, that each of us builds a personal recovery program. We reject the idea that there is a one-size-fits-all program that's going to work for everyone. Apart from abstinence, which is the bedrock of everybody's personal recovery program in LifeRing, that's the common generic element. Apart from that, there are as many personal recovery programs in LifeRing as there are participants. And we like it that way. And a little while later in my talk, I'm going to talk to you in more detail about how that works, why we do it, and why it's a good thing. But right now, I'm just summarizing. So let me talk to you a little bit about our meeting format. Now, you could summarize our meeting format as the 3 C's. Namely, we sit in a circle, C. We talk about current events, and we have crosstalk. We sit in a circle so that we can see one another's faces. The meeting facilitator, whom we call conveners, reads or asks a volunteer to read a very short opening statement that takes a minute or two at most. Then the convener asks, "How was your week?" and turns to a person in the room. That person narrates the highlights and heartaches of their current week and looks ahead to the next week. And then after each person has given their personal highlights and heartaches of the week, we open it up for conversation, for feedback, technically known as crosstalk. And then we move on to the next person. The atmosphere in LifeRing meetings is relaxed and conversational. It's like being in a living room with friends, sharing experiences and ideas. At the end of the meeting, we usually give each other a round of applause because we know that staying clean and sober is not easy, that those of us who do it deserve praise and deserve credit, and so we give each other that credit and that recognition with a round of applause. Now, there are variations on this format in different LifeRing meetings at different times, but this is what happens in most LifeRing meetings most of the time. And that, in a nutshell, is the LifeRing philosophy in the meeting format, the 3 S's, the 3 C's. Now, I want to talk also about the deeper process that's going on inside of LifeRing, and really to answer the question of how it works. How is it possible that this simple philosophy and this simple meeting format can produce the kind of changes, deep, profound changes that are necessary to bring about recovery? But before I get to that, I have to talk about a threshold issue, namely why we exist. The most common question that gets asked to anyone who talks about LifeRing to people is, what's the difference between you guys and AA or between you guys and 12-step generally? And that's a perfectly legitimate question. It's a question that we can't and shouldn't dodge and that we need to answer. I'm going to touch on some of those issues in the course of my talk, but I want to begin by underlining a great common philosophy and common practice that we share with AA, and that is our objective of abstinence. Because we firmly and unambiguously support abstinence, we have a powerful overarching thing in common with the 12-step groups. They also are abstinence-based groups. And so although we have other differences, and at times we have lively discussions, they always remain within a context of an overarching agreement on the objective of our journey. And as Charlotte Castle, the author, said, there are different roads, but we're on the same journey toward the same objective. And so, as I say, even though we argue and debate from time to time, it never rises to the level of hostility or enmity because we are brothers and sisters going to the same place. But now you may ask, if we have the same overarching objective, if we want what they want, why are we a separate organization? Why are we building a different road from the road that already exists? Well, to answer that, I want to talk to you about the results of 2 studies. And what they show in the first place is that by far the largest number of people do not travel on the road that AA has laid out. And the other study shows that the majority of the people who get to successful recovery from alcoholism did not travel the AA road. AA used to conduct membership surveys every 3 years. A staunch partisan of AA, Don McIntyre, analyzed these membership surveys statistically in the Alcoholism Treatment Quarterly in 2001, and the results of that study were reprinted in the Grapevine, and his principal finding was this. Based on 5 successive 3-year studies, all showing the exact same pattern. Out of 100 people who go to their first AA meeting, at the end of 1 year, 5 are left. And not all of those are sober. The drop-off is dramatic. 100 people go to meeting 1. At the end of 30 days, 80% have left. At the end of 90 days, 90% have left. And at the end of 1 year, only 5 are there. In other words, there's something about the road of the 12 steps, even though it works fine for some people, that isn't a road that 95% of the people who try it want to travel. There's another study. You may suppose that those 95% all relapse and that they're lost. And actually, nobody knows the exact numbers of that. Nobody's ever followed up to see what happens to the people who walk away from AA. And we know anecdotally that walking away from AA is sometimes the end of the sobriety effort for people, particularly if they've been told that AA is the only way and that if you don't do AA, you can't possibly get sober. If they've been told that and they say, well, I'm not going to do AA, it's quite likely that they will have a difficult time staying sober if they believe those things. But in fact, if you look at the population of people who have succeeded of alcoholics who have succeeded in getting clean and sober and staying that way for more than 5 years, a study by Dr. Vallant of Harvard University found that 60% of these people who succeeded at recovery, by this definition, 5 years clean and sober, 60% did it without AA. That also was studied was published in the AA Grapevine. And I rely on that particular study because Dr. Vallant cannot be accused of being anti-AA. He doesn't have an anti-AA bias. He is a member of the AA Board of Trustees. So this is not a study that comes from somebody who has an axe to grind with the AA. There are other studies that put the percentage of non-AA recoveries at much higher, 75 or 80%. But 60% is admitted. And so what does this mean? What do these 2 studies mean? Well, they mean 2 things. Number 1, those of us who succeed in getting clean and sober independently by going off-road, as it were, by going cross-country off the 12-step road, those of us who are independent sobrietists are not exceptional cases. We're not outliers. We're not freaks. We're not weird. We are the majority. Successful recovery in AA is statistically the exception. We are the rule, those of us who do it independently or who do it off the AA road. And that's number one. It's important to understand that when you are in a life-ring room, that you are not weird. You are, well, you may also be weird, but but by virtue of being here, that doesn't make you weird. You're following a path that, if not with a life-ring label, but certainly in being off the AA road, is the path of the majority. And the second thing that these numbers mean is that as a society, as a nation, we are never going to make a dent in the alcoholism problem if the 12-step road is the only organized pathway to recovery. Not with those numbers. It's a very fine road, the 12-step road, for those for whom it works. It's a wonderful road. I have nothing against it. More power to you. But if that tiny road is the only pathway to recovery from alcoholism, then we're never going to see the end of this enormous scourge that claims so many lives. In order to make a serious dent in the alcoholism problem and addiction generally, we need more roads. We need wider roads. We need more roads with fewer obstacles on them that drive people away so that more people can find the freedom land of recovery, the freedom from drugs and alcohol. And I'm very encouraged by recent developments, talking around, looking around, seeing around, getting phone calls, listening to emails, that more and more people in the old line, more and more treatment professionals in the online treatment centers understand this and are opening up to alternatives, realizing that they're not going to hold their census, their population, if they don't offer them choices, and they'll start coming to us and coming to other alternative organizations to see if they can broaden the option of choices that's available to the clients. Counselors know the problem with the 12-step approach almost better than anybody. The first inkling of that I had was one Christmas season, when I was finishing up a life-ring meeting at a very 12-step treatment program, and a counselor had his head on a desk and was sobbing. He was sobbing. And I said, "What's the matter? What's going on?" And he said, "The 12 steps, the 12 promises, the 12 traditions, we promise them all this stuff, and it just doesn't happen. And when it doesn't happen, they go out on us. I don't know why we even bother. I don't know why we even try. It's just not working." This is a counselor, a very, very smart and very long time sober counselor in despair. And he's not the only one, because in the past few years, I've attended a number of conferences, KDAC conferences, NADAC, both counselors organizations, the APA conference, Psychological Association conference, and stood in front of the life-ring table and buttonholed counselors as they came by and said, "Life-ring is for patients." Oh, no, I said, "Have you ever had a patient or a client who says, 'I'm willing to do recovery, but the 12 steps are not my cup of tea'? Do you know people like that?" And the answers ranged all the way from, "Yeah, I've got some like that," to, "Are you kidding? They're all like that." And if you read in chapter 2 of this book, the new book here, you'll see a lot of individual quotations of that, and you'll also see a number of studies cited showing that counselors are very, very well aware of the fact that about 5% of the people that graduate from treatment programs that are sent to AA actually form an affiliation with AA, and the other 95% blow it off and don't go. So this is not a secret. What I'm saying here is not something revolutionary, unknown. This is widely known in the treatment profession, widely understood, and it's high time that we grasped this also and drew from it the confidence of knowing that what we are doing makes sense and that we have lots of company and that we are understood, that we should not be afraid. Now I want to go deeper into the topic and talk a little bit more about how life-ring works. In order to understand how life-ring works, it's helpful to understand what's going on when a successful recovery occurs. Because at first sight, a successful recovery is a mystery. Take, for example, my friend Alan, not the real name, composite. He was a supervisor who'd missed a lot of work because he was drinking and drugging. And he was known among his fellow workers as a short-tempered, red-faced, vindictive SOB. One day he got into a shouting match with a direct report, almost a fisticuff, almost came to blows, and was reported to HR, and HR called him on the carpet and says, "This keeps up, it's your job." He asked to be referred to the Employee Assistance Program. He got referred to Kaiser, which is where I met him. He joined LifeRing. He felt comfortable in LifeRing. He became a LifeRing convener. He met and married a sober woman in LifeRing. It happens all the time. He got his job back, of course. He got promoted. Today he's vice president of the company. And he is known as a very, very nice and trusted guy. And he's got a good life. Or take Yolanda. Yolanda was a loner who slept with just about anybody. She hung out in bars, and she had no self-esteem whatsoever, and she was a mess. But one day, thinking that she needed change, she went on the web and cruised and found LifeRing. And fast forward, today she's 20 years clean. Well, no. Today she's 18 years clean and sober. She found this before LifeRing existed. We'll get the chronology straight later. She's got a lot of sober time. She's remarried. She's got an extensive network of friends, and she's a happy woman. Or take Sandy. I met Sandy when I was doing a meeting upstairs here on the 4th floor in the 5150 ward. He was wheeled in on a gurney. His face was blue. A cop went with him, and he was in big trouble. He had tried to cut his boyfriend's face with a pizza cutter, and then gone into the bathroom, locked himself in, and tried to OD. And cops came, pulled him out. And 2 weeks later, Sandy was cheerfully chatting and was the life of the meeting, if you can, well, yeah, it was the life of the meeting. And a couple of years after that, he's in a gay comedy group, and he's got a, quote, normie boyfriend, and he's studying for a teaching certificate, and he's one of the nicest, warmest people that you would ever expect to meet. Now, think about it. At first, you see people who are addicted. They're enraged. They're stupefied. They're intoxicated. They're passed out. They're nasty. They're in the grip of their addiction. You don't want to know them. They're awful. And later times, they're lively. They're intelligent. They're warm. They're sympathetic. They're leading sober, fulfilling lives. What happened? Where'd those people come from? Where'd those wonderful, warm, loving people come from? Well, that's the great mystery of recovery, and I want to try to elucidate it here in a few words. To begin to crack this mystery, you have to understand that addiction splits people in two. In our addiction, when we're in our addiction, we have, as it were, two heads, or two personalities in one head is probably better, like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Whenever I talk to audiences of recovering people, I ask them, am I the only weird one who has like, my head is like an apartment with two tenants living in it that are fighting all the time? And people say, no, you're not the only one. This is my head as well. It's a common experience of people who are addicted that you have two forces fighting in your head. And this isn't just a literary metaphor like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. It's not just anecdotal evidence. In the book, you'll see I quote a long string of people who are like longtime clinicians who've seen thousands and thousands of addicted people, and they say, this is the core experience of being addicted, is that you have these two forces going on in your head. William White, who was our keynote speaker standing right here 5 years ago, wrote in his book that addicts want simultaneously more than anything, both to maintain an uninterrupted relationship with their drug of choice and to break free of the drug, both to go this way and to go that way. And this shows in the incredible lengths to which the addict will go to sustain a relationship with the drug, on the one hand, and his or her efforts to exert control over the drug and sever his or her relationship with it. In other words, part of the addict wants to cling to the drug, part of the addict wants to get free of the drug. That's the core reality of being addicted. Now, If you hang around LifeRing long enough, you'll see that we've developed a jargon to cover the situation. By way of radical simplification, I propose that we label the two people inside the addict's head with S and A. S being the sober part, A being the addicted part. The A is the voice in your head that says, time to drink, time to use, let's go score, let's get high. S being the part that says, no, not again, I want to go to work, I'm sick and tired of this, it's too much money, it's boring, I don't want to do this. And back and forth and back and forth. So there's the A and the S, just for simplicity's sake. Use any other abbreviations or labels that make sense to you. The important point is not the label. The important point is to understand that there's a fight going on. Now once we understand this, once we understand this basic core reality, we come to a great fork in the road. Most addiction approaches, old addiction approaches, focus on the A. The strategy is to heap the A with insults, to hammer, to puncture, to lacerate the A, the addict self, to wage a war on the A with all available weapons in the hope of deflating and crushing the A and thereby healing the patient. It's a plausible and seductive strategy because when people get into treatment and support groups, very often the most prominent feature of their makeup is the A, the addict behavior. That's what got them into treatment or into support groups most of the time. So you would think that it's like, the A is like a huge boil, and you would think, well, the obvious thing to do is to lacerate that boil, and you're going to restore the person to sanity or reality or what. Unfortunately, the therapeutic record of attack therapies, of confrontation therapies, is extremely poor. There's been a comprehensive review published just recently in Counselor, which surveys the extensive literature on confrontation and attack therapy and says that the most effective thing they do, the one thing that they're effective in doing, is they're effective in producing relapse. Because you could say that even if they succeed in deflating the A in the person, they don't do anything to build up the S in the person to take the place of the A, so that when the person leaves the program and goes out into reality, they don't have a viable, sober personality structure, a resilient, sober personality structure that would allow them to survive on the outside. And so they crash. The other strategic approach, is the one that most modern therapeutic methods take. This approach sees both the A and the S and the conflict between them. And its approach is to try to form a therapeutic alliance with the S, the sober self. In general terms, these approaches are called strength-based or asset-based. And these approaches exist not only in addiction, but in psychology generally, also in education. I heard a keynote speaker at an education conference speak about working with troubled kids, and he said the way to work with troubled kids is to approach them by saying, I believe in you, you can change, you are a great kid, you can do this. That's a strength-based approach. Cognitive behavioral therapies, motivational interviewing, choice theory, dialectical behavior therapy, solution-focused therapy are just a few of the names of the particular approaches that are strength-based. Despite different tool sets and vocabularies, they all have in common the vision that the addicted person has inside them resources for change, and that the task of those who want to help is to see, to recognize, to honor, to support, and to reinforce the resources for change that the individual carries within them. This view doesn't ignore the inner A, far from it, but it recognizes that slaying the inner A, as it were, can only be done by the inner S, or has been said, it's an inside job. And so that the central task of helping people is to enable them to empower the sober self inside of them. And that's why we've taken that as our LifeRing slogan. If you look underneath the LifeRing logo everywhere, it says, empower your sober self. What we're talking about is that you have this self, this resource for change within you, and that the objective of our group process is to empower that sober self so that it becomes dominant within you. I like very much the saying that Albert Schweitzer said. He said, every patient carries his or her own doctor on the inside. Well, that's a way of saying that every person with an addiction carries the power to get well inside. I also like a saying of the old Greek philosopher Archimedes, who said, give me a place to stand on and I can move the earth. Well, the S inside the addicted person is that place to stand. If you stand on that place, you can move the earth inside that person and around them. Now I want to take a second and a little more deeper look at the life-ring process. And the first thing that people notice about life-ring is a general positive attitude in the room. Because life-ring works on the basic principle of supporting and helping to empower the sober self, the life-ring experience is a positive experience. People ask me, how does life-ring work? In a nutshell, life-ring works through positive reinforcement. The most powerful force for emotional change known to psychology, positive reinforcement. And that atmosphere pervades the meeting. The fact that you're in the meeting entitles you to respect. Your desire to be clean and sober, your S, brought you there. Your best thinking made you decide to get free of substances and to come to a support group meeting. And you deserve honor and respect for that choice. That shows you have a good brain capable of making rational decisions. You deserve applause for that, not to be shamed. Chemical dependency is not a sin that you have to atone and confess for. It happens to all kinds of personalities. And life-ring meetings don't exist to humiliate you or to demean you or to make you feel guilty for your substance-using past, but to support you in building your substance-using present and future, to make a fresh start, to reinvent yourself as a clean and sober person. When people introduce themselves in life-ring meetings, they may or may not label themselves as alcoholic addict. We take a very pragmatic attitude toward that. Hey, if using the label addict and alcoholic helps you stay clean and sober, if it reminds you you mustn't drink today, by all means use it. It's a great thing for you. But if the label makes you feel demeaned, if it makes you feel stigmatized, if it makes you feel typecast, if it makes you feel limited, if it makes you feel like relapsing, don't use the darn label. Use some other way of describing yourself. I am a competent and free person who has an addiction that I'm working on, and I'm confident I'll overcome it. Introduce yourself that way if that works to you, okay? And there's no pressure in a life-ring meeting to either use or not use the label. It's your call. The same is true of the disease theory, which I'll talk about a little bit later. If that works for you, that's great. If it doesn't work for you, don't use it. We're completely pragmatic on it. We're agnostic on the disease theory, and we don't take an official position on it. Now, our circular format also helps build positive reinforcement from the S to the S, because in the circle format, you can see each other's faces. It's much easier to give emotional reinforcement to a person whose eyes you can see, rather than to form emotional bonds with the back of somebody's head. It's more difficult. The focus in our meetings is on the here and now, on the week just past, and on the week ahead. We avoid extended drunkalogues and drugalogues because we know from experience that the detailed recitation of our drinking and using history triggers many people, particularly vulnerable people. It triggers their urges and desires to drink and use. And I've had so many people tell me that when they listen to an extended drugalogue or drunkalogue, they just fly out of that meeting and get the nearest drink or the nearest hit of drug. Our concern is with the present and the future. The past will take care of itself. It's the present and the future that we have to work on. What we're doing is we're turning a sober magnifying glass on the string of small decisions that we do every day, every week. And those small decisions add up to great liberating changes. In life-ring meetings, we encourage crosstalk. And that's recovery jargon for feedback, for people do in normal friendly conversation. Our purpose is to create the supportive bonds between the S and the S that I mentioned. To get that synergistic flow going between people, you need to have two-way communication. You need to have conversation and crosstalk. If you hook up jumper cables between two cars and you only hook up one wire of the jumper cables, how much current are you going to have going between one and the other? Zero. If you listen to a lecture on recovery, how deep an emotional change is that going to bring about in you, including this one? Minuscule. It can do other things for you. It can work on your abstract reasoning. It can work on your understanding of the world, but it's not going to change your behavior. And that's but one word of feedback from a peer. Like one word of feedback from my son, Dad, you're a drunkard, aren't you? Can be world-changing. It's enormously powerful, and we build that power into our meetings, into our meeting process. And there's nothing artificial about that. It's just what people do in friendly conversation when they're being supportive of each other in a living room talking about what's going on in life. That's normally how people talk. People don't put each other down. They don't trash each other. They're supportive to each other. They're understanding. They try to get into each other's skin, to be good to each other. And that's what we do in meetings. Now, as I said earlier, we don't do religion in Life Ring meetings, but that doesn't mean we don't do any kind of spirituality. Certainly, we don't do the kind of spirituality that relies on supernatural forces, powers, ghosts, and so forth. Those things are more properly called religion as we understand it. But there are many other dimensions of spirituality. Basically, what I'm talking about is forms of communication that rise above the utilitarian, above the economic, above the mechanistic. The most common kind of spirituality that you see in Life Ring meetings is caring. When we say, how was your week? That shows, I care for what's happened to you. I want to know what's going on with you. Caring, sharing, letting other people know what's going on with us. Affection, empathy, sometimes just plain old love, let's say it, love, flows freely in Life Ring meetings. And in that sense, we are a very spiritual program. We have a secular spirituality that feels warm and positive when you step into it. And the final round of applause that we give each other is a fitting, upbeating conclusion to that atmosphere. What's going on in a nutshell is positive S-to-S reinforcement. Now, if you look at my book, you could see that this is not only an emotional or mental process going on, but it also has a physiological dimension. The famous Canadian neurologist Hebb articulated what's called as Hebb's law, which says that neurons that fire together wire together. And that means that in your brain, the synapses that you activate, the ones that you use, they grow strong and they grow vigorous and they get fast. They transmit current really fast, and those become dominant in your brain. And the synapses that you don't use, well, they wither away and die. Well, now in our Life Ring meetings, what are we doing? We're enabling and energizing the synapses of the S in our brain. We're connecting that with the S in other people's brains. Juice is flowing back and forth from S to S. Synergy is happening. And that means that in the brains of each of the participants, the S synapses are growing stronger and faster and higher voltage. And the synapses of the A don't get a workout at all in our meetings. They just get completely ignored. And consequently, at the end of the meeting, what you see is that the S synapses in our brain are strong and juicy and vigorous, and the A synapses are withered and dry, and nothing's happening with them. And that means that in the overall territory of your brain, the S has grown, the A has shrunk. And even if it's grown just a little bit, that means that the meeting has been a very successful exercise indeed, because it helped to empower your sober self. Even if by only an inch, it will have been worth it. Now I want to talk, as I said I would earlier, about one of the most controversial aspects of the Life Ring approach, the fact that we each build a personal recovery program, or PRP in abbreviation. The common foundation of each of these programs is abstinence. I've made that clear twice. I'm going to say it again. The common foundation of all our personal recovery programs is abstinence from all the addictive drugs. But how we maintain our abstinence, what we do with our lives, what kind of persons we become, what philosophy we adopt, those are matters for each individual to discover and to determine. This really should not be controversial. Fitting the treatment to the patient is the standard procedure in medicine, in real medicine. But it's not been the standard procedure in treating chemical dependency. Chemical dependency has been an outlying field where the prevailing practice is to bend the patient to fit the treatment. Not only bend the patient, but sometimes hammer the patient to fit the treatment. It's therefore useful to hear the voices of some people who are authorities in the field of chemical dependency treatment who say that that which is done in standard medicine should also be done in standard addiction treatment. In my book, on chapter 6, I cite a number of these, and I just want to cite one small quotation from NIDA, the National Institute of Drug Abuse, which did an extensive survey of what is effective in treatment. And they found that no single treatment is appropriate for all individuals. There is no effective one-size-fits-all program. Rather, matching treatment settings, interventions, and services to each individual's particular problems and needs is critical to his or her ultimate success in returning to productive life. Now, there are 5 or 6 other quotations to the same extent, and I'll spare you those. You can read them in the book. What it says is that science, as well as common sense, dictate that treatment, professional treatment, must respond to the needs of each individual. Now, it would be absurd if the individual's self-treatment were held to a lower standard than the standard to which professional treatment is held. Professional treatment is held to tailoring the treatment to fit the patient. Should the patient then go out and take a program off the shelf on the one-size-fits-all philosophy? No, that's absurd. The patient as well should adopt the approach of fitting the treatment to the patient. In other words, what science and common sense say is that both the professional and the client, him or herself, should build personal recovery programs. LifeRing embraces that principle. We have looked at what treatment professionals know to be effective, namely individualized treatment. We adopt that to self-treatment. That's why we don't have an off-the-shelf, one-size-fits-all approach, because those don't work as a rule. They work for a small number of people, but they're ineffective for most people. So now matching the treatment to us as individuals is what we should do and what we do. We have 2 paths in LifeRing for doing that. One is the more or less random access path of going to LifeRing meetings. You go to meetings, you share your stories, the decisions that you have to make, you get feedback on the decisions that you're making, and that string of decisions that you're making from week to week really amounts to your program. But there's also a structured way of doing it. Instead of building your program based on the events that may or may not come up at a meeting, that you group the various decisions that have to be made into a set of discrete work areas, group them together so that you can go at the task of building your personal recovery program in a more organized and more structured way. Now, I won't conceal from you the fact that this is challenging. It's difficult. It requires effort. It supplies the workbook supplies a lot of questions to ask yourself, but there's no answer sheet. You can't cheat. It's not to test yourself. It's not to test your knowledge about addiction textbooks and what's in them, but it's not about finding out what other people did in their recovery. It's finding out what works for you. Now, the rewards of that are considerable, though. Having done it and having talked to people who have done it, I can tell you that there are rewards. Number one, you'll gain a lot of self-knowledge. You'll be really looking at yourself pretty hard, and you'll understand yourself better than you did at the beginning. Number two, the program's going to fit you well. It's tailor-made. You're going to be comfortable in it. It's not going to be like one of these ill-fitting suits that you can't wait to get rid of. It's going to be a comfortable program that you'll want to be in always. It's a portable program. It's not anchored in the rooms of a treatment program so that when you walk outside, you leave the program behind you. No, it's anchored in your personality structure, and so it goes with you at all times. You'll feel a sense of ownership in your personal recovery program, and rightly so, because you made it. You should feel a sense of ownership. You will be invested in it. You're not tempted to just drop it casually because you put a lot of effort into working that out and understanding yourself. You'll be resilient because you built the program, you understand how it works, and if you need to change it because something's come up, you can change it because you know it. You're going to feel good about yourself. You'll carry a positive can-do attitude into the rest of your life because by building this personal recovery program, you've solved one of the more difficult things that there is to do in life. You have a reason to be proud and to be confident that there will be other challenges in your life that you can also meet. You can hold your head up high. In other words, the challenge of building a PRP is going to bring out the best in you. When you started, your S was small and weak and timid and scared. But in the process of building your PRP, your S has become competent, confident, a personality that can handle anything, that can walk with your head up in the world with the confidence that whatever challenges come your way, you can handle. We conclude with a few words about genetics. Back in the 30s and 40s, when the genetic theory of alcoholism became very popular, there was almost no science of genetics. The tools were extremely crude. There was no way either to support what people said or to back them down off of it. Today, the technology is phenomenally more advanced. The whole genome has been sequenced. Scientists can today almost look at any molecule in the DNA and tell you what it does. The closer we can see, the better we can see, the clearer our vision with the tools that we have, the less we find in the way of a genetic origin of alcoholism and the addictions. As the science becomes more advanced, the genetic theory of alcoholism is fading and in retreat. There are prominent scientists today who say, not the ones that are invested in genetic research, but others who do genetic research without having a grant from the alcohol studies, who say that the genetic search for the alcoholism gene, and not only the alcoholism gene, but the genes thought to underlie many other psychiatric disorders, simply may not exist, and that the research is a bridge to nowhere. And they're suggesting that the enormous amount of money that's being spent on that could be better spent on education and prevention and treatment. Now let's step back and look at the big picture. The composite image of a person addicted to alcoholism as seen through the lens of the old dominant paradigm. This individual is powerless, insane, morally deficient, filled with wrongs, a menace to others. Not only that, that person has an incurable fatal disease. And the final cut, this person was born constitutionally different from normal humanity, genetically deficient. The individual who enters most alcoholism treatment facilities is likely to be exposed to all of these propositions one after the other like a gauntlet or like the teeth on a chainsaw. I've done a lot of reading in the literature in the process of preparing this book, and my reading of the scientific literature tells me that not one proposition in this chain of reasoning, not one tooth of this chainsaw has scientific validity. Not one. Now let me return to the beginning, or near the beginning. This is not like the Windows operating system where to stop you push the start button. I described three individuals who were transformed, Alan, Yolanda, and Sandy. First you saw them completely messed up, angry, hostile, nasty, people that you want to avoid with a 10-foot pole. And later you see them, they're warm, they're caring, they're passionate, they're intelligent, they're witty, you love them. And I asked, how is it possible that these are the same people? Where did these bright, warm, lovely, sober folks come from? Well, now we're in a position to point to the answer. The answer is that these bright, warm, lively, sober folks were locked up inside the nasty, self-destructed, addictive people all along. Substance addiction is like an overlay that covers up the original sober self. It imprisons the sober self like a shell. And that what recovery does is empowers the inner sober self and sets it free again. The central task of constructing a workable and credible paradigm of recovery is to regain warmth and respect for the inner character of the person who suffers from addiction, for what I've called the S. Maybe a voice from another era, 170 years ago, can jolt us toward a clearer understanding. I quote, "In my judgment, such of us as have never fallen victims have been spared more from the absence of appetite than from any mental or moral superiority over those who have. Indeed, I believe, if we take habitual drunkards as a class, their heads and their hearts will bear an advantageous comparison with those of any other class of people. There seems ever to have been a proneness in the brilliant and the warm-blooded to fall into this vice. The demon of intemperance ever seems to have delighted in sucking the blood of genius and of generosity. What one of us but can call to mind some dear relative, more promising in youth than all his fellows, who has fallen sacrifice to his rapacity? He ever seems to have gone forth like the Egyptian angel of death, commissioned to slay, if not the first, the fairest born of every family." That's the voice of Abraham Lincoln, speaking to the Washingtonian Temperance Society Convention in 1842. Now, in describing the class of habitual drunkards as having heads and hearts no worse than the average, and as including some persons of brilliance and passion, genius and generosity, the future president surely wasn't romanticizing inebriety or minimizing the wreckage that it caused. He was affirming that persons who fall prey to addiction are in no way inferior to the rest, and that addiction can happen to the best. He was seeing the warm, worthwhile human being inside the addict, the S inside the A. There is no rational cause to set addicted persons apart by their nature, character, or constitution from the rest of humanity. No reason to view them as inferior or to accord them less empathy and respect. To put it more personally, there's no reason for us who know addiction from the inside to beat ourselves up and to view ourselves as inferior, different, or less worthy of the world's empathy and respect. The most fitting metaphor for recovery is liberation. Liberation as a metaphor points to the sober self imprisoned within the addicted brain and affirms its inherent dignity and value. Liberation conceives recovery as the empowerment of the sober self, bursting the shackles of chemical dependency, and emerging as the original sober person, newly freed and reborn. Although this may sound revolutionary, it's in reality a restoration. Addiction has hijacked the person's original self. It's stolen its energies, feelings, thoughts, and dreams, its very identity. Recovery gives them back. What we recover, when we recover, is our original self, the authentic us, the sober person we were meant to be and really are. Thank you.